Thank you. I want to quickly talk to you guys about the major challenges that we are facing globally and also what we children youth are trying to do about it. So if we think about the next 30, 40, 50 years, what do you think are the major challenges that we as a global society are going to be facing? I would argue that there might be three main challenges. The first one is population growth. Today we are 7.5 billion people. And the continent of Africa on its own has about 1 billion people. But the population of Africa, according to UN projections, is going to double by 2050 and then double again until 2100 to over 4 billion people living on just that one continent. We're probably not going to be able to avoid that first doubling, but by investing in the wealth of the continent, we can prevent that second doubling from taking place. And that leads us directly to the next big challenge, which is global economic inequality, is injustice. Imagine we have all the 7.5 billion people in this room right now, and we line them up. On the one side, we have the poorest people in the world, all the way to the other side with Jeff Bezos. Now, if the poor half of these people put all their wealth, everything they own, into one bucket, how many percent of the richest people would have to put all their wealth in another bucket so that they are equal? Is it 1%? That would be 70 million people. 0.1%, 7 million people? No, it's actually 8. It's 8 people. From Jeff Bezos to Charles Koch, these 8 men own as much as 1/2 of the world's population. And the third big challenge we're facing, which I believe is the most urgent challenge, because it makes all other challenges we face even worse, is the climate crisis. We've known about this climate crisis for decades. It was in the year 1896, 130 years ago, that the first 120 years ago, that the first scientists described the impact of CO2 on global temperature. 120 years ago. And at least since 1992, all governments of the world have agreed that the climate crisis is a serious issue. But in this time since 1992, since the Rio conference, not only did governments of the world fail to reduce our global CO2 emissions, but our emissions actually increased from 20 billion tons in 1992 to 35 billion tons today. Almost doubled in that time. And to understand why the climate crisis is such an incredibly important challenge, Syria, I believe, is actually the best example. We all know about the civil war that has been going on in Syria since 2011. But what a lot of people don't know is the results of a NASA study, which concluded that between 2006 and 2011, Syria faced the biggest drought in 900 years. And as a result of this drought, about 80% of all farm animals in the country died, and 800,000 farmers, 800,000 Syrian farmers left their farms, left the countryside, and moved to cities in the hopes of finding jobs, which led to massive unemployment. And there are WikiLeaks documents from the Syrian government where they clearly say, we don't know how to deal with these people. And this is when the Arabic Spring arrived and the civil war erupted. I'm not trying to argue that the civil war is only the result of the climate crisis, but the climate crisis clearly contributed to it. And what this teaches us is that in future, the climate crisis doesn't just mean water shortages and food shortages, but it means that our political conflicts that we're facing today are going to become a lot worse as a result of the climate crisis. And this is why the United Nations are projecting up to 200 million climate refugees by 2050. 200 million people that will have to leave their homes as a result of the climate crisis. And when we think about how we as a continent, we as Europe reacted to just 1 million people that joined us in 2015, what will 200 million climate refugees mean? But the good news is it's not yet too late to prevent this, to tackle the climate crisis seriously. And one of the things that we are doing to tackle it is plant trees. When I planted my first tree as a 4th grader, I wanted to save the polar bear because the polar bear was my favorite animal. But soon after, we understood that this is not about saving the polar bear. This is about our future. Floods are going to get worse all around the world. Well, in other parts of the world, droughts are going to get worse. This kid is not looking at its reflection in the water, but it's drinking. And this is why we made the sticker, Save the Human. When I was a 4th grader, I found out about Wangari Maathai, a fantastic Kenyan, the first female professor in Kenya, who started a movement where, together with lots of other women in Kenya and other African countries, they managed to plant 30 million trees in 30 years. So I told my classmates that we should also start planting trees. We should plant 1 million trees in each country of the world. Although I think none of us knew what a million was or even how many countries existed. But we just planted our first tree, and a few other schools started joining us. And then a slightly older student made a very simple website for us, which was essentially just a ranking among local schools of who had planted the most trees. So lots of schools wanted to outcompete their neighboring schools, and that's how Plant for the Planet took off. So after 1 year, we had planted 50,000 trees. After 3 years, 1 million. And children, youth all across the world started joining us and planting trees with us. But they weren't just planting trees. They started to do much more. They started giving presentations in their schools, or in front of Rotary clubs, or in churches. Many started talking to their local mayor to convince him to do more to tackle the climate crisis, or even their governors. On 3 separate occasions, our members have spoken in front of the UN General Assembly. And many have had the chance to talk in front of their parliaments or to have sit-downs with their presidents, always trying to convince them to do more to tackle the climate crisis. And of course, one way is planting trees. One great example is Yana. She's one of our ambassadors. She's just 12 years old. And a few months ago, she gave a speech at the conference just after the CEO of Deutsche Bank and the governor of her state. And the journalists only reported about Yana. And a few weeks later, her governor invited her to his state house, and she spent an hour trying to convince him to make his state carbon neutral. And all of this isn't an accident, because we train our members all across the world to do exactly that, to get involved and to speak up. And because of that, we've organized 1,200 Plant for the Planet academies in 67 countries to educate our members. And I want to show you what we do at these academies. They always start with a presentation from another ambassador who's in the same age, teaching them about what the climate crisis is and why it's so important that we get involved. Then all our participants practice giving presentations so that they see it's very easy. They can do the same. And of course, we plant trees, and after that, we collect ideas to different questions like, how do we get other children and youth involved? How do we plant trees? Or how do we organize? How do we get journalists to report about us? And then they create plans, what they want to do themselves in their schools. And at the end of the day, they present their plans in front of all the parents and then receive certificates as ambassadors. And I think it's this work with children and youth all across the world which inspired the United Nations Environmental Program to ask us to lead the Billion Tree campaign. That campaign had originally been started by our hero, Wangari Maathai. with the goal of planting 1 billion trees. And meanwhile, with the help of many governments, companies, and organizations all around the world, we managed to plant not just 1 billion, but 15 billion trees all across the world. So a while ago, we Children Youth of Plan for the Planet asked ourselves, so what's the next step? Where do we go from here? What do we do next? And because of that, we had two big questions. The first one was, how many trees even exist in the world? And the second question was, how many additional trees can we plant? So we asked lots of climate scientists and ecologists, and soon found out that none of them had any answers for us, because nobody had really tried to study this question before. But then we found a team of 3 scientists at Yale University in the US, and they agreed to do a research project for us. And after 3 years, they came back to us with 2 answers. The first one was that about 3 trillion trees exist. That's about 400 trees for every person in the world. And the second, more important answer was that there is room to plant up to another 1.2 trillion trees globally. And if we manage to plant all of those trees, they would capture about a quarter of human-made carbon emissions. So they wouldn't solve the climate crisis, but they would be a sort of time joker, giving us a little more time to reduce our global CO2 emissions. A time joker that we desperately need, because many governments around the world are doing far too little to reduce their emissions. And only that way we can make sure that our global CO2, our global temperature doesn't rise beyond 2 degrees. This is the same thing. I've represented a little differently, but I think it's impossible to see it for most of you, so I'm just gonna skip that. What we also learned is that it's not just about how many trees we plant, but also about how we plant those trees. And that's something I learned on a trip to the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. We spoke to the local forest minister of the state, and he told us that in their region, the average survival rate of tree planting projects is just 22%, which means that after 1 year, 78% of all the trees have died. So we wanted to show that it's possible to plant trees more efficiently and more effectively. And because of that, we took the responsibility for these 22,000 hectares of destroyed, degraded forest. That's about 50,000 soccer fields. And today, we have a tree nursery with 35 people growing saplings, and about 70 people planting these saplings. And we currently plant at a rate of 1 tree every 15 seconds. So about 8,000 trees a day. And we've reached a survival rate of not 22, but 94% in the trees we plant there. And each one of those trees we plant there just costs us €1. For €1, we can plant a tree. And of course, we want to make this as transparent as possible. So on our website, you can see our project and see exactly who funds which parts of our forest. And we want to encourage as many companies as possible to compensate their CO2 emissions, the emissions that they cannot avoid by planting trees, either with us or with any other tree planting organization around the world. Because we can only fund these trillion trees if lots of companies all around the world voluntarily choose to become carbon neutral by compensating their emissions. Another project that we work on is the Change Chocolate. This started about 6 years ago when we wanted to start a project with the German chocolate industry. But not a single company wanted to support us. So one of our ambassadors jokingly said, okay, let's make our own chocolate. And of course, we laughed at this at first, but it turned into the change chocolate, which is now the most sold fair trade chocolate in Germany. And the important thing is, this chocolate is carbon neutral and fair trade. And most importantly, the entire profit goes to Plant for the Planet, and we use it to plant trees. So with every 5 bars of the chocolate sold, we can plant a tree. And we're currently working on an app for the chocolate. So if you're out in the city near a store that sells the chocolate, you'll hear a beep in your pocket and know where to go shopping. And a few years ago, we asked the astronauts on the International Space Station if they wanted to try our chocolate as well. And shortly after, 12 bars of the changed chocolate were on board the Albert Einstein, a rocket to the International Space Station. So 2 bars of chocolates for every astronaut. And since then, we call it astronaut food. I think that's how it works. And of course, we don't need to just motivate governments and companies to help us. But we need everyone to buy in and to understand how important this challenge is. And one of the ways we convince people is through our campaign, Stop Talking, Start Planting, where we cover prominent people's mouths to show that it's time to act. And we did one such picture with the King of Spain. And this picture was in all newspapers in Spain. And not just in the newspapers, but on the cover pages. Here it's on the side, but we count that as well. And many of our members all across the world have been protesting to convince their governments to do more, like this one in front of the German Chancellery. And right now we're working on a new big project, which is all about making it as easy as possible for anyone around the world to plant trees. So nobody has any excuse that they can't join in. So we're building an app available on the web and also as an iOS and Android app. And everyone can download it and set up their profile. Now, if you're out in a forest or in your backyard planting a tree, you can then register that tree on the platform and tell us exactly what kind of tree you planted, where you planted the tree, and lots of other information about the tree if you want to add it. But what if you can't plant trees yourself? What if you don't have a backyard or just can't do it? Well, then you can use the app to donate to tree planting organizations all around the world so that they plant trees for you. And any tree planting organization anywhere in the world that plants trees can register their project on the app and receive donations. And of course, Plant for the Planet doesn't take any cut. All the money goes directly to that organization. And when such an organization registers themselves as part of the platform, they need to tell us a lot about what they do, which trees they plant, what survival rate they have, and they need to tell us exactly the geolocations, the exact coordinates of where they plant those trees. And we work with a satellite company and a cartography company, Esri, to then take monthly satellite pictures of these tree planting projects. So we can then show how this area where they're planting is transforming. And then the donor knows, I'm not just sending money somewhere that gets lost somewhere on the way, but can see how that area that he funded is slowly turning into forest. And with that trust that we're developing through this transparency, we hope to motivate people all across the world to help us. And to make sure that this is fun to use, we've got some other tools, like you can follow your friends and get notifications when they plant trees. Or you can start tree planting competitions with your friends. And you can see exactly where where these 15 billion trees have been planted all across the world. You can see where current forests exist and where forests could be planted in future. And you can see the ranking, the leaderboard of which countries, which companies, which individuals have planted the most trees. So this is the Forbes list of the future. It's no longer about who has the most money, but who has planted the most trees. And with this, nobody has an excuse that they cannot join and participate. And we're going to launch this in about 1 month. It'll be live in December at planfortheplanet.org. Now, if you want to get involved and do something, what we want to do at this conference, since we all traveled here, is to make sure that we compensate our emissions, that we all compensate our emissions of traveling here. So outside, if you go down the stairs, we have a booth where 2 of my friends are going to be standing there with the same T-shirt. And if you talk to them, they'll be here today and tomorrow. And we'll help you calculate your emissions, your CO2 emissions of coming here. And then you can donate the trees so we compensate your emissions. And we can all go back home guilt-free for our trip. Thank you.